And it is one of the issues that we want to have discussed in debate. So we would like if members of the platform or somebody else would debate with us these issues in the Istanbul Convention. There are many, many more. As I say, the notion of gender-based violence is another issue that we have from.
Okay. And there's James up here, and then we'll go back to the panel, and then I can come back.
I just want to come back to one of the points that Lynn raised about the workplace, because it is potentially one of the areas where much greater attention could be given to prevention. And there's some really interesting initiatives developing across Europe, mainly modelled on really fantastic work that is, I must add, driven by the unions actually in Canada and Australia to get domestic violence as a workplace issue onto employers' agendas. And I think one of the possibilities is to use the prevention mechanisms in the Council of Europe's, in the evaluation mechanisms, to ask some of those critical questions about to what extent were prevention initiatives introduced in the workplace. For instance, around safety planning for women experiencing domestic violence, for example, around issues of domestic violence leave, or changes in work location, or just very simple things like giving women access to a safe parking space or a safe office space. Because when Lynn mentioned the issue of financial independence, it's probably the most crucial issue for women trying to get out of a domestic violence situation. So it would be really interesting to have a further debate about this, but also because we're talking about data. It's actually a really important area. We have no data really in Europe on the extent of either prevention mechanisms in the workplace or the numbers of domestic homicides that have actually taken place in the workplace. I know, for example, I'm involved in a European-wide research project on this issue. We've identified through 11 country case studies, 20 cases of women who were killed in the workplace by their partner or ex-partner. And we know that is a complete underestimation because the data doesn't always record those homicides as domestic violence abuse related. So I raised the challenge really. It's a call for a challenge to start thinking about how we can look at the workplace as a potential area around prevention and to encourage employers, trade unions, shop stewards to address these issues. I'll just give you one example. I interviewed a woman in Denmark and how she got out of her domestic violence situation was that she had been increasingly isolated in the workplace. Her colleagues complained to the employer that she had terrible BO, and they found it really difficult to work with her in the office. And through the employer talking to the shop steward, who had been trained in domestic violence counselling and support, discovered that actually it was a form of coercive control she was experiencing, but she wasn't allowed to wash or change her clothes. So it was we often think about violence as physical violence, but there's all sorts of. And in the interview, she said it was brilliant because the shop steward worked with the employer, got her possibility to have a safe work location because she was really, really worried that if she left her violent partner, she'd be killed. Very kind of serious situation for her. And she said it was through this kind of very sensitively organised support in the workplace that she was able to feel safe to leave her violent partner. She said, if that hadn't have happened, if I hadn't had that shop steward, I'd be dead now. And it's the reality, actually, workplace measures can, at a very early stage, help to prevent women being killed. So I think it's a new area, I think, for many of us to start thinking about this issue. The other thing I just wanted to mention really, really briefly is that the International Labour Organization is now discussing the introduction of a new convention on violence at work, and they're calling it Violence Against Women and Men in the World of Work. However, this is going to have a very strong focus on gender-based violence, and there's already a global campaign started with the global NGOs and the trade unions. And I just wanted to say one success that has so far been achieved is that the discussions for this convention, which is going to go through a standard setting arrangement in 2018, is that the employers were initially against the principle of domestic violence prevention in the workplace. And they were persuaded in the experts group to actually include this in the convention. So it's a huge breakthrough. And I can send the link to Orla and Jacqueline, and maybe send the link round to people to see the conclusions of that. And the significance of this is if it gets into the convention, it can get into European policy, and it can really, we can get a much greater focus on it. But I would also add, just in terms of data, how important it is that this gets monitored in the workplace in terms of data collection. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jane. So I'm going to go back to the two, and then I can go back. So just to recap, there was a question on ethnic identifier and how it's applied. Then there was a question around collecting data in terms of frequency, regularity and intensity in March. Then the issue about there needs to be more debate on the convention and the structural nature of violence. And then finally that workplace issue. Yeah. So maybe both of you want to comment on those?
Okay, just on the first point from the lady from PAVI point on the ethnic identifiers, I think it's always crucial when you are collecting data on anybody, and it is sensitive information, that there's understanding as to why that data is collected and that it's not going to be used against communities. And I know, for example, with schools, there's a big problem about people sending their children to schools outside of their area because there might be a large traveller population in that school. So it is very important that those identifiers are not used in any way to discriminate against any group in society, but it is important that we use it sensitively. And it's the same even with that Danish model. Initially when I read about it, I would be kind of, all my gut instinct is always against sort of this surveillance or collecting data, but when it's encrypted and used in the right way, it can help us to form policy. So it is about talking to people and not just picking one group in society either, that we're looking at the broad elements of it. In relation to, I suppose, the debate on the Istanbul Convention, I think, in terms of the data that's there and how women are, the vast majority of the cases of domestic violence are perpetrated against women. And if we want to look at, the Victims Directive will look at all victims, and the collection of data in that will allow for then in the future, let's analyse and see if that's not the case. But I think the vast majority of experts in the room would say that it is women who are, by a long stretch, I think the current analysis is 1% of men are victims of domestic violence. So, but the Victims Directive does deal with that issue. It does look at the collection of data of all victims and how they process through the procedure. So that will allow and open up then, if we're proven wrong, well then let's have that discussion. But I suppose for me, it's when men resist these efforts and measures to be taken to protect our women, our sisters, our mothers, our daughters. I find it frustrating. I'm very lucky that I have a partner who absolutely supports me 100% in life, and I would rather see our men support our women, because if we don't, it's all men are being tarred with the same brush. It's all men are then looked as the ones who can't control themselves or control their urges if they see a woman who's drunk or who can't give informed consent. So I think it's in the interests of men, genuine men who have women in their lives and want to support those women, to support them in being safe in the world. On the workplace, I think one of the examples, and you're dead right, about the need for trade unions to be on board in this. I don't think the Irish trade unions are. If there's anyone in the room can correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's just not on their agenda or their radar. I'd love to see somebody drive it. I know in an Australian example, and we're talking about financial independence, but what Australia has done is its other measurements, as you said, safe working environments, a separate phone line, and barring orders from the car park of workplaces. So there's lots of measures in that. But what they found that initially was when it was voluntary, it was unsuccessful, and that it had to be implemented on a standardised right for all employees. And you'll only do that through the support of the trade unions. So I would use this opportunity to call out to the trade unions to support certainly getting some measure in Ireland to protect all victims of domestic violence, so not just women, all victims who are in employment, and that they have a safe place to work. And most of the cases, people will tell you it's either a good boss or a good shop steward, and that's not good enough. Everybody should have those protections in their workplace.
Yes, thank you. I'll proceed in the same order. In referring to the intervention concerning Roma and traveller women, I'd like to remind you that the convention also has a provision. The convention has a provision whereby states parties are called upon to be careful that women, because of their belonging to certain groups, are not discriminated against in accessing the services, protection services and other services. So this is really a very important aspect of the convention. Another aspect of the convention is that it acknowledges also that there can be vulnerable groups of women, and that the situation that these women belonging to these groups face can be further compounded by the difficulties that are inherent to their belonging in these groups. So yes, the convention puts the focus on this as well. And as for your concern concerning data, when the convention says that data should be collected, having in mind the norms on data protection, well, one of the norms of good data protection is that whatever data is collected, as you rightfully mentioned, is not excessive. That is to say that it is strictly the data which is necessary for the purposes for which the data is collected. And this also needs to be properly communicated, announced by the entities who are collecting the data, so that the persons involved also know about it, because it's, in a way, it's a contract that is passed between the agencies collecting and the persons also involved, and so these terms have to be respected when using and storing the data. There was also a question concerning the frequency of acts, and in order to assess really the seriousness of the various forms of violence. I think that for the Istanbul Convention, the frequency also is very important, because the convention wants to help state parties determine if at the various stages in which women contacted the services, maybe there was a fallout, in the sense that they maybe went several times without the appropriate action being taken. And so it is important for states to know maybe where they need to focus more attention, and where there's this risk that the woman simply I can't find really the right term, but is in a way falls out of the system, although there were certain signals that would have allowed the state authorities to jump in and to help her. Then turning to the question on the gender perspective in the Istanbul Convention, and the opinion which was voiced that this is not evidence-based in itself. I can't really answer directly that, but I know that the Istanbul Convention in itself is the outcome of years of work which was carried out at the level of various international organizations, and not only the Council of Europe, because the convention was preceded by a recommendation of the Committee of Ministers in 2002, and so it is the work of the reflection which was done in monitoring this recommendation. But there is also all the work that has been done in the UN with the VAW Convention, and that dates back really further, and also the legal landscape in which the convention found its place is also counts also other treaties, other regional treaties, such as the Inter-American Belize Convention, and then there's also the African Charter, protocol to the Charter on Human Rights. So I think that this is where the Istanbul Convention comes from and is built on. And yes, debate is important because for the Istanbul Convention, it is important to have men and boys fully on board for the implementation to be effective. And then coming to the workplace, indeed, the convention contains a provision which I think the provision is in the chapter on prevention, saying how important it is for the private sector and the businesses to be involved. I think that when Grevio will be carrying out its evaluation visits, it will be taking the opportunity also to talk with trade unions, and so they will be certainly partners in this process. And at the same time, the convention talks also about economic empowerment of women, because it realizes how important it is for women not to fall further victim because they are endangered or because they are made more vulnerable because of violence against women.
Because I hadn't addressed your question about the online abuse or the frequency, and you're right. I think you need to monitor these things all the way because they're constantly changing. I mean, a few decades ago, you wouldn't have had the mobile phone text problem. Now we have the online, the cyber stalking of social platforms. So we always need to be cognizant that it's constantly changing and evolving, and perpetrators will always find a way to get at their victims. So it's something that we need to monitor. And I know that the audio-visual directive is up for review at the moment, and I'm not sure if that is actually addressed in it. Certainly bullying and that, but I'll actually look into it and see if it's not too late to possibly even try and include some sort of amendment that would deal with that. But it's constantly evolving, and we can't allow it to slip down the radar. We have to just keep working and keeping up to date with the changing platforms.
Hi, I'm from Community Roma, and I'm here today because I want to ask something. But before to ask something, I must to tell, we have a case in UK, a family with 6 children, and the man who was violent with his wife, the wife, go and complain to the Department of Social, and the people from there, they help her. But now, because I don't know to say, they make something, they take the children, they put the children in a court, they split the children to the 3 families in foster care, because there are 6 children. And now the mother is desperate because want the children back, but this was abuse, violence to the mother, not with the children. But they split the children, and the mother is very unhappy. And the society from here, Roma, they found, and everybody says, oh, if we have in the future, conflict with the husbands, they don't help because they are afraid. They don't take the children. And now I ask the question, how we can help, this family to have the children back, because they go in court and the court decide that stuff for them.
I'm Anne-Marie from Tuslam, and I just wanted to say that I welcome the focus on the data collection as the focus of today, because I think it's an area that we do need to do a lot of work in, given the fact that so much of this type of violence still remains hidden. The numbers of people coming forward are still quite limited, and that limits the amount of data that is actually available and the use usefulness of it. And I suppose I'm conscious that even within areas of sectors, there probably are different mechanisms for collecting data and different types of data collected, say, that they have between GPs maybe on the one hand and accident and emergency on the other, different maybe agencies within the criminal justice system, or even different aspects of CUSLA. And I'm just wondering if there's any views at the moment as to how that process of linking all that data together might actually, you know, begin to develop, or whether there's any agency like, say, the Central Statistics Office, or how that process might be led forward. I'm aware that CUSC has the role around policy, and I'm not too sure how it would work around that. That's just thank you.
Hi, my name is Carol. I'm also a researcher based in the School of Global Women's Studies in Galway. I have two comments, and one is a follow-on from the lady before me, just looking at sort of our state's approach to data overall. So we've heard about the failures of the PULSE system. It's similar in healthcare, the sort of data that GPs collect, that's collected in hospitals. None of it is available, none of it can be analysed. And it can't be analysed across ethnic grounds, it can't be analysed across age grounds, and that's true and important for violence against women, and it's true and important for a whole host of other social equality issues. So there's a bigger data problem that we're dealing with, and it would be great for it to start to get addressed under the remit of the Istanbul Convention. And it will have an impact for more than just violence against women, but it's critical. And the second point is maybe to broaden the spectrum again. We haven't heard much about economic data, and in fact, it's very, very difficult to find out exactly what the state is spending on violence against women. So again, we can find out in quite a straightforward way what budget allocations are to the likes of TUSLA or CUSC, but digging down into what the Garda spend, or what the health sector spend, or what the social protection spend is, that's disaggregated in any kind of gender way, is very, very difficult. And on the other side, we really have no perspective on the economic cost of violence to this state. And it's similar to the way that we have really no perspective on the economic value of the care work that goes on. It's something that just isn't part of our economic analysis. And in the team that I work on, we are fully convinced that if we could really clearly evidence the number of ways that violence against women is eroding and undermining our economy, that could make a very, very persuasive case for much greater investment.
I'll take them back from the breaking for coffee. So, Christina, do you want to start and respond to some of those? I mean, there's the general wider ones in terms of issues around data, issue of children.
Yes. As far as the question of children is concerned, the Istanbul Convention contains provisions that, well, for one thing, I would say that the Istanbul Convention also establishes in a way the notion that children who are often themselves victims together with the mother of domestic violence, even when they are not victims of violence, are in a way victims of violence, even if they simply and merely witness violence against women. And this is I think a very essential notion. And I think that the Istanbul Convention adds a dimension to the discourse that is in place, that whenever decisions have to be taken as to the children with whom they should live, that attention in priority should be given to the best interest of the child. I think the Istanbul Convention makes it clear that the best interest of the child is also best based on the best interest of the women, in the sense that if there is violence against the women, this should be taken into consideration in taking decisions, for example, in the context of divorce arrangements, in the context of divorce, or for visiting rights and so on. And so there is a special focus on this thematic in the convention. I think that most of the other questions were perhaps more related to the national situation in Ireland, apart maybe for the one on cost. But there again, I think that you are well placed to maybe to take a position on that. What I know is that when the European Commission proposed that the European Council sign and ratify the Istanbul Convention, it also contained a clear indication that it is important to bear this in mind as a factor to push states to take on board the reflection on violence against women.
And just to say, because I'm very grateful, Marion Walsh is here from the Department of Justice and also leads CUSP, who's our national coordinating body. And Marion, would you just like to maybe comment a little bit wider?
General remark in relation to some of the issues that have been raised on the election. As the Minister of State has outlined in his remarks, there is work in progress, and it's at an early stage of development, we would admit, and we have a lot more to do in relation to what is being done with the state agencies to collect under the various criteria he set out. We rely on the full picture, and plenty of people here this morning have spoken about other people who need to be reached out to. This is an action under the second national strategy. There's 18 actions that are required under the strategy to be completed to enable us to ratify the Istanbul Convention. We realise it's not the full picture. The strategy, we've always said, is a living document, and evidence of that is since it was published, we've added some new actions to it, in particular actions taken by An Garda Síochána. And as I say, we realise it's not the full picture, and that there are others that have to be reached out to, such as non-governmental organisations, just to mention just one small example of people who've to be reached out to. And we have done work in this area with other sectors in relation to victims previously that we can build on, and we'll be doing that also. So just to make those comments at this stage.
Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose just I'm not familiar with the British system in terms for dealing with victims of domestic violence and then what happens to the children afterwards. But just I suppose in relation to the Roma community and the experiences in Ireland, I think one of the big problems is there's a lack of trust with official agencies, and that has to be bridged. We have to reach out to the Roma community, and I mean, when we seen what happened in Tala, you can understand why there's a lack of trust especially in governmental agencies. So there's a huge body of work to be done, and I know the Roma and Travellers, the EU strategy on trying to work on building the trust and the issues that are quite specific to the community itself. And I suppose that's where our NGOs and those who are working on the ground with the community could really play a role in, I suppose, allaying fears, and also being, I suppose, that bridge or advocate with the community and the government agency. I don't know, I suppose, on the non-heterosexual and Sarah, I don't know the answer on the observatory, so maybe I'm going to pick that one up. On the issue of the different agencies' collection, I think we should use the Istanbul Convention as the opportunity to finally get our departments all talking to each other and collecting data in a uniform manner. I know, and I refer back just in the speech when I said that the coordinating body for the collection of data does have the capacity to communicate directly, and I know they're doing work, but I would kind of say be as proactive as possible in doing that and reaching out to the various agencies and explaining the need for it. And it's not about telling a department how to do its job or telling the guards, but it's about explaining why we need the data to be uniform so that we then can make policy that's actually effective. But it is a problem in Ireland, and I think that we have an opportunity here, because if we're going to ratify the treaty, we have to have those departments talking to each other in the collection of that data, that they could just broaden that scope and do it. And as the person pointed out, there's a whole realm of opportunity that comes out of the collection of that data. And then, of course, you have to resource the analysis of that data, because there's no point in just collecting it and then having it sit somewhere. So it's important that we properly resource the use of it then. In relation to the economic cost, I always find it unfortunate that sometimes we have to go down that road, but there is an economic cost, and it's huge, and it's like with alcohol as well, the economic cost. And if that's what it takes to get governments to sit up and pay attention, well then so be it. I hate that that is the case. We should be doing it because it's the right thing to do. But if we do measure it, it does leverage the levers of power. It does open doors. If we can even just point out to, I suppose, the savings to the state if we've put in place the proper supports and mechanisms for victims of domestic violence and victims of crime. But as I said, it is unfortunate that that's the road we have to take.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just to finish up before we go for coffee, just in relation to your point that you raised, Lynn. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why today we really want to put an emphasis in terms of this whole issue of diversity of women, and that while we're saying, and I mean very clearly within the collection of national data, this needs to be uncovered, but also within this gold standard idea, there very much is the provision, and they talk about having, you know, qualitative surveys where you can dig deep down in terms of the different experiences of different women. And I think, you know, so looking at LGBT and that is critical and is really important, and that's why within the observatory, like, we are trying to look at it in terms of that sort of three-pronged approach. So it's not just about looking at the general, because too much stuff is hidden, and we really do need to look at that whole diversity issue. But I think I wanted to come in on the point that was raised in relation to children, because I think there's been quite a bit of discussion about that as well in the last 16 days, and certainly in the report, the Bernardo's, What's the Harm, that they launched, but particularly just how this whole issue is neglected, and how women with children are not being supported in terms of when they either go and report, and how they can be supported, and how the children can be supported in those situations. And we also have a complete lack of information as to what's happening to children and particularly within domestic violence and domestic abuse relationships. So yeah, I think it's a really important issue that you raised. And I don't know if Women's Aid want to say something, but I mean, Women's Aid are probably, I think, the only organisation actually who have tried to count some of this economic cost in terms of domestic violence. And I think, yeah, it's a really important piece. And I know in the UK as well, Women's Aid are also doing that there. But yeah, it is critical because this affects the whole of society. So yeah, an important point to be raised. We're going to break for coffee, and then we're going to have a wider discussion in our panel. And Christina and Lynn are also going to stay for the panel, and we'll be joined by some others. So we're back for half 11.